Okay, perfect. Thanks, everyone. You hear me okay? Okay. Are there any designers in the room today? Okay, brilliant. It's actually nearly a half of the room. Thanks for coming. I was actually stressed that it's going to be engineering-only event. Hey, everyone. My name is Daria. I'm one of the product designers at Intercom. When I was invited to give this talk, I wasn't really sure what to talk about, like future of Frontend. I'm not an engineer. I never trained as an engineer, never learned how to code. But I have been using AI tools, and specifically AI tools for coding, for over a year now. And if I look back, the way that I design has actually changed quite a bit. And not because I learned how to code, I didn't, but because building things with AI changed how we approach design problems and what the role of a designer actually includes. And that's what I wanted to reflect on today. A bit of context about myself. I joined Intercom about 7 years ago, worked for a couple of years in the pre-AI era, and came back when the company pivoted into AI and reinvented itself completely. Last year, I got pretty obsessed with Cursor and Claude Code, and I ended up in the top 3 users of Cursor out of 400 people in the company. I built a number of prototypes, and I got busted for using too many tokens twice last year. The projects I work on most of the time are new features and 0 to 1 products. And that's why I primarily build things outside of our code base. However, I do have experience working with Surge that Pat mentioned as well. But I think the reflections that I'm going to share today, they apply across any setup. And it's going to be 4 lessons that I learned that I want to share with you today. Lesson 1. When you start building something, you quickly run into design decisions you couldn't have anticipated just by thinking about it up front. The product's behavior has complexity that only shows up when you actually start testing real scenarios. I'll show you a recent example. As a part of expanding Fin, which is our AI support agent, into broader customer agent umbrella, we've been exploring different use cases. And one of those use cases is essentially e-commerce, where Fin can operate as an e-commerce agent, like a shopping assistant, on top of staying a support agent. That's currently in beta, and we have a number of customers using that already. So it understands the intent of each query and decides how to handle it, whether as a support or shopping query. And if you think about this behavior, it kind of feels straightforward. If a person asks something like, I entered wrong delivery address, can you help? That's clearly a support query, just handle it as normal support. Or if someone says, I'm looking for a modern desk lamp, just handle it as shopping. But then you start building, and the complexity shows up immediately. Someone says jacket. What does it mean, really? Is it like a problem with the jacket that they ordered, or they're looking to buy one? Or someone says, my jacket order is delayed, but I also need a pair of socks. That's like support and shopping intent in the same sentence, and which one should you prioritize? Or someone is really frustrated and they want a replacement, not a refund, but a different product. And again, that's the support and shopping intent at the same time in the same sentence. And there are lots of those fuzzy queries if you start actually digging into that. And each of them is solvable if you think carefully, but it's really hard to predict all of this, like what all of these cases add up to until you actually test dozens of real scenarios. You have to build the thing to actually understand the behavior and the scope of what you're actually designing. So the way I approached it is essentially I built a prototype using Claude API where I could edit the system prompt, the retrieval logic, and tweak the agent behavior directly. And I also put together a spreadsheet with a lot of test cases that I could think of. And every time I would change the logic and the behavior of an agent, I would run all of those test cases, see what peeled off, adjust the logic, and run tests again. And I did quite a few of those iterations until I was happy with the overall behavior. And we ended up using those learnings that I got from testing my own standalone prototype to build the behavior for the real agent we are testing with customers. What's interesting in that with this approach, if you think about it, building, designing, evaluating, and making product decisions all happens in parallel at the same time. You're testing while you're still figuring out what the behavior should be. And a lot of the discovery used to be sequential with the more traditional design process. Now a chunk of it happens in a single session. And that doesn't replace collaboration with other people and function, obviously. But what you bring to those conversations with other teammates is much more tangible and much more resolved, because you've already run into hard cases, you've seen what breaks, and ultimately building becomes how you develop your sense for the problem. And that applies beyond AI products as well. Like any complex interaction and any complex system has design decisions that often stay invisible until you try to build the thing. The first lesson was about discovering products complexity through testing and building in parallel. But there is a different kind of challenge, and it's about the structure of what you're actually building. A lot of people describe AI coding tools as having a junior engineer on the team. It wasn't really my experience at all. To me, it feels more like the most senior engineer. It will endlessly listen to your feedback. It will do all the iterations that you ask for. It has really deep technical knowledge. It can implement basically anything, but without proper context and without understanding of what you're actually building and why, it can't do anything useful. It just sits there waiting for direction. And as your concepts get more structurally complex, providing that direction becomes pretty critical. I'll share another example. I was exploring the way that conversation with Fin could be integrated into customers' products. Today, we have the Messenger widget that pretty much everybody knows who is using Intercom, but we wanted to see what are the other ways, though, this conversation could actually manifest and integrate more deeply into customer products. Things like the side panel, like a floating thingy, something embedded directly on the page. And I kind of had a really fuzzy idea of how this should work when I started, and I just ran with it and started building, assuming that AI would just figure out how everything should work, what the logic behind the scenes should be, and it all started to fall apart. So you can see that there is the same conversation displayed in many form factors, and I was expecting it to have the persistent state. So for instance, if you close one state, it should open in the other, which obviously didn't happen because I never communicated that to the agent that was building my prototype. And other things didn't work, like the logic didn't make sense, transition didn't work properly. And the deeper I got with those explorations and added more features, the more tangled it became. So I ended up essentially just starting from scratch because how complex it all started to look like. And it wasn't that the tool failed or AI didn't do the right thing. The problem was that I hadn't really thought through what I wanted to build, and I didn't think through some of the core behaviors and design decisions that I wanted to manifest in those designs. So when I started over, I wrote a PRD, which is essentially just a document trying to answer some of the fundamental questions about this design. Things like, what am I trying to achieve with this prototype? What am I optimizing for? Who is this for? Is this just for my internal exploration, or is this for testing with end customers? What are the core principles behind the design and the behavior? Like, what can I fake? What should feel very real? And all sorts of things. And I think that kind of echoes what Pat was talking about, the planning and research upfront, which actually what I ended up doing for most of my prototypes now. I usually start with just writing this PRD. I obviously use AI to help me work through those questions and details, but I do a big chunk of thinking myself upfront. And it forces you to actually learn to articulate your thoughts properly, not just make this thing work and make no mistake, which rarely works in reality. So I learned that unclear thinking has cost that's immediately visible. If your thinking is vague, the AI output would also be pretty vague. And this writing, the process of writing and shaping your thoughts helps you see gaps right away. And once this document essentially is written and once you're happy with the overall logic, the building part is usually pretty easy because that's the agent executing things for you. And what I think I learned is that essentially when it comes to design, AI coding doesn't necessarily make the design work faster. it just distributes the effort and moves it mostly upfront and upstream into deep thinking, planning, and research. And the deeper you think upfront and the deeper you plan, the easier it is to build and iterate down the line. So the first two lessons were about what you discover through building and testing and what you need to prepare before you start. This lesson 3 is going to be about where to point the effort once you do start building. Not every project has that, but in my experience, quite a few of them do. There is a part of the concept that everything else depends on, and you have no idea if it will work, especially with no engineering background like myself. So for instance, a technology that you never worked with, a platform you never built before, if that unknown exists, I usually start with that first. Another example, I had this idea while still working on the e-commerce agent. I had this idea to surface access to Fin directly on an e-commerce product page built with Shopify. So users browsing the website and like evaluating different products could actually get their questions resolved without leaving the page, without having to look for support, and just be able to click something right away on the page. But I kind of had no idea if that's even viable. I obviously never built anything for Shopify, never even used Shopify at this stage. So the first question was like, how do I even do that? And a bit of research showed that there is a concept of Shopify apps that you can develop and let merchants add to their store through no-code editor. But obviously, I had no experience doing that. So I did some talking with Claude Code. It walked me through how to set up the Shopify developer tooling and help me build the actual prototype that you're seeing on screen. That's essentially an embeddable block that you can drag and drop on your storefront template. That shows pre-generated questions based on the content of that page. And when you click on one of those questions or you submit your manual one, it pulls up our Intercom messenger and it streams the answer from Fin right there. And I didn't do any like design or interaction polish at this stage. I just wanted to see if this thing is viable and if I even need to like try to push this idea to my team. And it turns out to be like pretty viable. Another example, and that's from the side project a while ago. I wanted to build a product that collects newsletter emails that I sign up to, summarizes them, and turns them into a podcast episode. I sign up to like dozens of newsletters. I don't really have time to read all of them, so I wanted to have this medium that I can listen to once a week. And that was, I think, before the Notebook LM existed. And the whole concept depends on multiple steps working together, like fetch emails, summarize them, polish the summary into a good narrative, and convert to audio. If that pipeline doesn't work, there is nothing really to design. And like as a non-engineer, again, like I had no idea about the complexity and the cost of the system. So I started with validating that part, like the system would actually work end to end. So I set up a database where I could see inputs and outputs at each step. And if everything executes correctly, I would have an audio file that I could just download and listen and understand whether the content is like viable, if the generation was correct and everything else. So there was no design at this stage. I just used I think that's a super base to see the actual output from the generation. And once I was able to validate that this part works, essentially I moved on to other things like design, pricing, user experience, and everything else. So the point I'm trying to make, and that's probably sounds pretty obvious to engineering audience in this room, but for someone who doesn't really have this engineering background, there are a lot of open questions about whether the ideas that I imagined to myself make sense and like are viable and are feasible to build. And getting that answer early helps really shape everything else downstream. The last lesson that I'm going to talk about is essentially showing what my actual work looks like when I build those concepts and prototypes. I'm going to go back to the e-commerce project that I mentioned a couple of times already. So I needed to explore how items, actual like products from the product catalog, should be presented to the end user while they're asking Fin for recommendations and while Fin is sending those product recommendations to them. Things like the layout, metadata, states, interactions, and so on and so forth. And if you're a designer, you understand easily that all of those states multiplied by a number of variations end up in dozens of screens in Figma that you have to review, carefully put together, evaluate, and present to the team, and it gets pretty messy and hard to maintain. To make this easier to explore myself, but also to present to the team and stakeholders, I built an admin panel in the prototype that I was building alongside the actual UI where I was testing the conversation and behavior, where I could toggle between all of those variations and states that I wanted to test. Things like the card details and metadata that we display on card, what it looks like with and without rating or description things, what the design of each card should look like, whether it's a carousel or a grid layout, what's the image ratio, and so on and so forth. It was much easier to comprehend, but also evaluate against each other and land on an option that felt most reasonable to everyone else. Another example, my favorite one, I had a prototype where the conversation window dynamically samples the background color of whatever website it's rendered on top of. And then it adapts its own color to match that website on the background. So I first validated the sampling thing, and it turned out to be a fairly easy thing to build, but I needed to experiment with how this color gets applied. So the intensity, the opacity of this color, what color space we're using, and so on and so forth. And following the example before, I built a similar admin tool specifically for testing those granular settings, like how the color gets rendered, and which allowed me to very granularly fine-tune each of those parameters, but also test it against multiple websites at the same time. So most of my code prototypes right now end up with some version of this admin panel that I use for my own explorations, for alignment sessions, for testing with real customers, and so on. And what I realized after building a bunch of these is essentially that each admin panel becomes a design tool that you purposefully build for your specific problem that you're solving. So ultimate goal of those is to help me explore and make the decision more easily than I would do in a traditional design process in Figma file with dozens of screens. And that's what I think code becomes when you're designing and building. That's a way to build your own custom design tooling shaped to whatever problem you're working on. So those are 4 lessons that I wanted to talk about. They're about what you discover when you build and test in parallel, how you plan your work up front, where you put your most effort when you start building, and what your tooling could look like. That's obviously just my own experience, but across our design team, most people are already using AI coding tools, and everyone's workflow looks pretty different. And what's most interesting is that there is no really single right or wrong way to do things. You kind of find your own way into building and designing based on what your work looks like and how you think. And that's the prototyping hub that Pat mentioned as well. Domingo, our designer, worked on it quite a bit. And the other GIF is from the procedures. That's a product that we launched yesterday publicly. That's a way to solve complex products. Queries, sorry, for Fin. And they also use the same kind of admin panel tooling to help explore the detailed design for those procedures, which is super interesting. So tools are essentially flexible enough that people shape them to fit their process. And that's what makes it super interesting. There is no just one size fits all solution. I was thinking about how to finish this talk, and I wasn't sure. And I asked Claude to write me a good closing thought, something profound, and came back with this quote. The future of design isn't about the tools we use. It's about having the courage to reimagine what creation means in the age of infinite possibility. I have no idea what that means, so I'm not going to use that. I'm going to wrap here instead, and thank you very much for listening.
So we have time for a few questions. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation. Regarding the last part where you talked about the admin panels that you created, sorry, I was wondering if you have considered using AI as a means to drive A/B experiments on those variations as well. So using the AI to find the best suitable approach for the customers.
Honest answer, I haven't. But someone actually told me about the same idea recently, and I'm going to definitely explore something like that. Yeah, this is really interesting. Like, I don't know why I haven't thought about this before, but it's really logical to try something like that. Yeah, thank you.
Hey, thanks. You know, for your third lesson, which was about testing the riskiest assumptions first, and you might have the AI give you a solution that it tells you will work and is really going to solve your problem. How do you actually validate that? Do you bring it to an engineer in your team and say, because theoretically everything's possible, right? And AI is going to tell you that. I could tell you that as an engineer as well, you know, but it's like what's actually feasible in the time to do things. So how does that process work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it really depends on what's that riskiest assumption. So for instance, the thing that I showed, I think a couple of slides before, this dynamic sampling, I did prototype it, and that was like the main question that I had in mind, like, would we be able to dynamically sample the color? Would it impact performance of the messenger and so on? And what I was able to build, I just brought it to engineers and I asked them, like, would it work for our actual setup where we have more complexity than in my like standalone prototype? And it turns out it worked. So like the validation moment was engineers just saying that actually that's fine, we can do that. The other time when I was building the like newsletter into audio converter, that was pretty much just my own judgment. If the thing works and the output is of enough quality for me, for my personal taste, that was pretty much it. So like, I think it really depends on the problem and what's the riskiest assumption. Sometimes I do those things to not even bother engineers to do spikes. Like if I can actually build a Shopify app myself, why would I bother the team that is busy with something else more important? So like that's a way for me to get confidence to bring it to someone else who actually has more skill set and like more experience in that. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much, Daria.
Thank you.